Dr. Prash Puspanathan, and I hope I said that right, is a medical doctor and former Neuropsychiatry Fellow at the Alfred Hospital in Melbourne, is one of Australia's leading advocates for accessible psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy, and also the co-founder of Enosis Therapeutics, a startup leveraging virtual reality technology as a therapeutic tool for psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy. In his other life, Prash founded and ran as CEO for 5 years Caleb and Brown, the world's first dedicated cryptocurrency brokerage. As an active investor in both public and private psychedelic companies, Prash straddles both the financial and scientific sides of the psychedelic fence. And the reason why that's particularly relevant for this afternoon's panel is because that is the intersection of capital and the hoarding of it, and how psychedelics fit in that discussion. So, Prash.
Thank you, Nick, and welcome everyone. Before I introduce the panel, I might just do a bit of an intro for some context into why this panel. In September, so 3 months ago, 2 months ago, I was at the ICPR, the International Conference on Psychedelic Research in Amsterdam. And there was a panel with a whole bunch of venture capital partners, psychedelic venture capital partners. And at the end of that session, I asked a question, which one, probably didn't leave me very popular, and two, wasn't answered very well. And so it led me to thinking that this is a pretty relevant topic that needs to be discussed, and EJ was a perfect forum for us to discuss this. And I'll try and frame that question into more of a thought piece, but that, the psychedelic ecosystem used to be a field. It used to be a scientific field, and as scientific fields are, at least we believe that they sort of grow the relative organicity, being led by academic thought and research. But then some point along the line, money comes into the picture, and it ceases to field, and it now becomes an industry. And industry has quite different motives because the intentionality is considerably different. There are now obviously fiscal motives, fiscal incentives, which drive that what was a field and is now an industry forward. And I guess the question I pose to the VCs that if you control a lot of the money that is going into the space and therefore are effectively voting with your money to decide in what direction this industry is progressing, that I would like to know what are the ethics and what are the principles that you're holding on to, which are then going to be driving or shaping this industry going forward. There wasn't a conclusive answer, but maybe we'll get to something here in this panel. It's easy, though. It's easy to sort of hate on money. But the flip side of the fence is that the fact that this has become an industry also means that things like greater access for patients, the clinical trials, are all going to be catalyzed in a way that we wouldn't have been able to do if there wasn't as much money in it. So it's a good sort of dichotomy that we have to straddle. And I'm hoping the panelists that we've been able to pull together today will be able to help shed more light. I'm going to keep the introductions very brief because I like each panelist to introduce themselves, at least with the particular context of why their presence is particularly relevant to this conversation. Sean Duffy, who is the CEO of Reset Mind Sciences, they have, I think, the first regulated and licensing, correct me if I'm wrong, mushroom cultivation plant based out of Western Australia. Sam Bannister, who should be joining us shortly, but is the Chief Scientific Officer of Silo, which was, I think, Australia's first psychedelic startup. And Sam is their sort of lead biochemist wonderkind. And then there's three people who fall into the don't need an introduction category. There's Lily Kay and David, who most of us would know, who have been casting a very sharp spotlight, a microscope on the entire psychedelic landscape. And then there's Martin Williams, who's been a stalwart of the psychedelic community in Australia. In fact, Martin was a stalwart of the psychedelic community probably around the time when I had my first psychedelic trip. So that's been a while. So I'll leave my panelists to introduce themselves and also to open with a little bit of a monologue on their thoughts on this subject matter. Maybe I'll start with Sean, perhaps.
Sure, thanks, Prash. And thanks for having me on. My name's Sean Duffy. As Prash said, I'm CEO of a company that's based in Perth, Set Mind Sciences. We've got one of the first Schedule 9 licenses to legally cultivate psilocybin mushrooms. And alongside that, we're also well down the path, having submitted for ethics a Perth-based clinical trial using psilocybin along psychotherapy for treatment-resistant depression. So I guess why I'm here is I'm somewhat of the audience, maybe the poster child of the corporate type person entering the psychedelic field. And I think it's important maybe to give a little context before I give some of my views around how I've got to be here. I've had a long career in the corporate world. I come from a finance background. I'm not from a medical healthcare background. I'm not from a cultivator background. But what I do have is 20 years of living with a wife that has dealt with depression her whole adult life. And so I've seen firsthand the journey of someone bouncing around from SSRI to SSRI and everything that comes along with that. And having lived that life, I feel like there's got to be other alternatives out there. So my wife and I had been following psychedelics like many people have, purely out of personal interest and looking at it from the perspective of where treatment might go. And that, I won't bore you with all the details, but basically that led me to think how can I bring my background, my skills, my contacts, my experience to help make this happen. And so that's how I've come to be in it. I've been in it full time for 18 months after putting a lot of time into it before that. And I think I'm really glad we're having this discussion. I think the fact that we're having it demonstrates the undeniable competing tension that exists within the psychedelics field as to whether or not there's a place for people from the corporate world, and if so, where they fit in and where what role they should play. I think that I think I'm very used to it. I feel like everyone, when they first meet me in this field, casts a very cautious eye over me and my motives and background and why I'm here. And I think, and that's fine. I often feel like I'm on the witness stand, and I'm always happy to tell that story. But I suppose from the background that I've come from, I think I've seen in both the corporate world, the not-for-profit charitable space, research, government, I've seen good and bad actors in all fields, and I don't think that it's necessarily fair to always just cast those in the corporate field as purely financially motivated. I think there's a lot of capital and a lot of expertise that can help make this happen, help make psychedelics happen. And I think to an extent, I think people's view of the corporate world is often shaped by where they would like to see psychedelics get to. And I think if your primary focus is around potentially decriminalization for healthy individuals using psychedelics, which I personally am very supportive of, but if that's the main focus of your journey or your role in psychedelics, then I can completely understand why the corporate world would be seen to a degree as the Antichrist. If on the other hand, like me, I want to see psychedelics to be able to integrate into the healthcare system that we have and be an option to treat mental health conditions that are out there, then I think it's very important that the capital and expertise that the corporate world can bring in navigating through regulators, navigating through the healthcare system, can actually help make this happen as opposed to be a hindrance. I hear a lot the term for-profit to summarise the corporate world, and I think that brings connotations of people that are purely motivated by money, and I think there obviously are people like that, but I think that's unfair in a lot of cases. I think it's very important to point out in the psychedelics field at the moment, that no one's making any profits. Anyone that's putting money into psychedelics is doing it with very patient money and with an outlook that's very dependent on regulators and regulatory change. And if you're solely motivated by money, you will be investing in other areas. This is not an easy field to navigate. And so I think it's incumbent on everyone in the psychedelic space to really cast a cautious eye and a critical eye over those that are in the space. There's absolutely no doubt that there will be people that come into the psychedelics field purely to try and capitalise on momentum and make a buck, and certainly want to see those people weeded out as quickly as possible. But equally, where there are people that come in that can help accelerate things and bring an industry to fruition, then I think they should be welcomed in.
Thank you, Sean. A few points there that I will be diving back into a little bit later. Next up, Lily Kay.
Hey there, I'm Lily K. Ross, and I was part of the team that put together the controversial, apparently, Cover Story Power Trip podcast. I still can't figure out what's so controversial about pointing out that bad research and sexual assault is bad, but here I am. So I would say, by way of introduction, that I think I've seen some of the worst that this field has to offer as far as research conduct and misconduct and abusive practices. I've learned a tremendous amount by doing so and by attending to the analysis and perspectives and voices of people who have been harmed. So my training academically is as a feminist victimologist, and I am a proponent of the idea that when we listen to marginalized voices, we learn a great deal. When it comes to psychedelic research, I am agnostic about the research. I would like to see more research done. I would like to see that research done to a very rigorous standard. And there was a recent publication that I didn't plan to mention, so I don't remember who to cite for it. And maybe Dave will pull it up. But it's to do with the fact that a number of academic journals have been lowering the bar as far as what they're willing to publish in the arena of psychedelics. And I think what we really need is to really hold that bar right where it is, at the very least, in order to ensure safe and ethical research practice. So I think one point that I will make now and may make again, that I make quite often, is that I think quality research depends on really going back to qualitative and pilot studies that would be pre-phase 2 in order to determine what it is that constitutes safe and ethical psychedelic therapy. There is no established norm for what constitutes psychedelic therapy that has been debated and rigorously researched and understood. And so we talk about the drugs, but there's the psychotherapy aspect of things that I think is often overlooked. And so I don't want to talk too much longer because it's my 3-minute monologue. But I do think that within this field, there have been a number of missed learning opportunities. So this pattern of silencing harmed parties and silencing clinical trial participants, for example, who have been harmed, and not really taking those accounts seriously, those are all missed opportunities to improve the field, to tussle with ethical questions that don't have easy answers, to figure out what clinical practice and safeguards could look like. And that's a huge wealth of knowledge that has been missed, and with real human costs as well. And so I think that's one of the things I would advocate for in this field going forward, and to realize that, the introduction of so much capital and financial interests, I think, is one of the many forces that is coming into the research space and inflating things perhaps before they're ready to kind of be at prime time. And I think as a result, we're getting some really screwy narratives that are hurting people. So drugs, cool, decriminalize everything. That's my position. I do non-prohibitionist critical psychedelia, I think is what we've been calling it lately. So yeah, I'll leave it there. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you. Pass the mic on. I'll pass the mic on. David, please. Perhaps.
You're muted.
Yes, there we go. I passed it, but was passed. I didn't pick it up, or at least didn't unmute. Thanks for having me here as well. Keen to, I'll keep my intro short because I just, I think, introduced myself by way of the last talk. But I think there's a few things that are worth considering as food for thought. I was one of, if not the first person to offer a comprehensive systemic critique of the corporate incursion into psychedelics going back to 2018. And what I predicted at the point when the only real visible players were Compass Pathways and to a smaller extent, Blues Pharmaceuticals, who was Blues Benefit Corporation, that was looking to get into LSD research. Is that it doesn't really matter who the people are, that there are systemic realities of that dictate how people act, right? Like if you know, there have been numerous stories about iPhones and the horrors that come with them, and you know, Steve Jobs could have said, well, we're not going to do it this way anymore, and then his board would get rid of him and find somebody else who would, and then maybe you can show the board all of the horrors that go into an iPhone, and eventually the shareholders are going to say, yes, but we require return on our investment, and they're going to get rid of the board. So there are, this is bigger than people. This is not about whether people have good intentions or bad intentions. This is about offering systemic critique. And back in 2018, when I pointed out that here are the ways capitalism functions, we can expect patent wars, we can expect attempts at monopolization, we can expect pharmaceutical exclusivity agreements, we can expect people making bullshit versions of the same drug over and over and over again, as we see with, you know, whether we're talking about the barriers to access, particularly in the United States, whether we're talking about insulin or asthma inhalers, like there's quite a laundry list of pre-existing problems, both within the medical system, but then also within the social dynamics, the worker dynamics that are enforced down the barrel of a gun by a system that exploits its workers in order to accumulate surplus capital. And so, like, understanding that, like, I don't think anybody involved in corporate activities is the Antichrist, certainly not because I'm interested in decriminalization. I think that there are certain ways that their behaviors are constrained by the game of capitalism. And I actually think, you know, it was a really good point made earlier that there is corporate expertise in navigating regulators. We actually tend to call this regulatory capture, and it has some really upsetting results. In fact, one of the people behind Compass Pathways, and I critiqued this in 2018 as well, pointing out, look, George Goldsmith has a history in regulatory capture. They put out this documentation about Beyond the Pill that explains how to maximize pharmaceutical profits because the drug is a very small portion of it. And so when we see this influx of corporate psychedelic actors who are keen to get us to pair smartphone apps and wearable devices and augmented reality, what happens to all that data? We live in a world where there's the increasing monetization of our most intimate moments. And now see with psychedelics, there is this incursion into some of the most granular biomedical data. And that's something that I'm concerned about, that I haven't really gotten an opportunity to talk anywhere. And I hope we might be able to broach some of those issues on this panel. So really happy here. Thanks.
Martin, can I get you to launch in?
I'm really sorry, I haven't prepared a manifesto for you guys, so I'll do my best. Look, Prash, you were making me feel rather old, but in fact, I still feel as if I'm the 18-year-old who first embarked on this, long journey, and so I suspect a lot of us feel like, look, it's been an absolute privilege to be involved in this field. I have to admit to having put in several camps. I grew up embracing a tradition of left libertarianism, Dave and Lily Kay, that ultimately assume the innate intelligence and wisdom of all of us. So like that is my sort of premise. But also, of course, I'm a small business owner. I've been running a company for the best part of 30 years now. So look, I think there's scope for all of us to come together in a really interesting conversation. Having been involved in this particular field, hoping to evolve and develop psychedelic medical research for over 12 years, and having been involved in this particular scene with EGA for almost 20 years, I've seen a lot come and go, and I am loving, embracing, and fully involved in all of those aspects now. So I'm really looking forward to this conversation. I think we've maybe spread a little beyond the scope of this discussion in our preamble, but nonetheless, I think there's lots more to explore. I'm disappointed we only have an hour to discuss, so I'll stop right now. Hand over to Sam.
Thanks, Sam speaking from a lecture, just to assert his authority.
Hey. I don't know if people, I have a strangely psychedelic experience going on right here because I've got a really frozen version of the Zoom with some disembodied voices, and I'm just trying to work out. I'm guessing everyone can see me on the screen there at the lectern and hear me all right?
We can see you and hear you just fine.
Awesome.
Keep going.
Yeah, apologies. I didn't realize it was online only today, so I was already here. I'm Sam Bannister. I'm a sort of recovering academic who's also founder and chief scientific officer of a pretty exciting company called Silo. So we're really interested in the development of sort of next generation psychedelics, compounds that are inspired by the pharmacological properties of psychedelics, but not necessarily sort of copycat molecules or small tweaks that improve them in sort of minor ways. We're really looking to understand the underlying science and develop truly sort of revolutionary medicines. I've worked on psychoactive substances for a very long time in my academic career across a number of classes. I've been doing drug development sort of in the academic and private sectors for about 15 years now. So I've spent a lot of time thinking about how to develop medicines, which medicines are worth developing, path to market, and all of these sort of later stages of the process. So I came to this field with an interest in sort of ethnobotany broadly. So I'm very familiar with plant medicines and other things. I've worked in the cannabis space for a little while, but Silo is really heavily focused on sort of pharmaceutical development of these next generation agents. So it's a super exciting space to watch. There's a number of sort of ethical concerns raised by Lily and others around how some of the current trials have been conducted with fully psychedelic agents. I think there's definitely a lot of work to be done and a lot of sort of ethical considerations, but the reason people are so excited about this field and sort of deploying all this capital into it is because, at least some of those people, and hopefully a majority of them, believe there can be some enormous impact here with these substances.
Thank you, Sam. I'm going to start off with the first question. I'm going to direct it to you, Sam. And so in the last year, so financial year 2021, there was approximately 2.1 billion was invested into the psychedelic industry as a whole. This is from an LEK Consulting study, of which approximately 1.8 billion went into drug development. The psychedelic therapy process involves it's a process that involves multiple different components, of which the drug is only one. But we do know that investment in the space is heavily weighted towards drug development. And I'm sure a lot of us may have our own particular thoughts on that. I'd like to pose this question to you particularly because obviously you would have very strong opinions on this, seeing as you work on it. And maybe if you can talk us through particularly, this development of analogs, the development of new molecules, there's development of whole plant, there's development of non-hallucinogenic substances. I'd like to hear your opinion on where the money is being distributed, where it should be distributed, answer it in the way you see it.
Yeah, sure. I have thought a lot about this space. As I mentioned, I have a bit of a plant medicine background. I've also done a lot of synthetic chemistry and medicinal chemistry. In this area, a lot of the efforts have gone towards sort of rapid clinical development of existing psychedelics with some merit. There's also been a lot of focus on the development of what I've sort of termed low-hanging fruit. So analogs where you've made very simple changes, largely for sort of fairly weak composition claims and a direct path to market. So I'm thinking of things like prodrugs, deuteration of existing molecules that changes metabolism in a very slight way. All of these make sense within the current drug development model and then the way it's incentivized, but I don't view those as truly, revolutionary medicines. Making a slight change to the metabolism of psilocybin, which is already a pretty good drug, doesn't really change its subjective profile and its clinical profile that much. I think the more interesting work is still yet to be done. And it's in the generation of molecules that move increasingly far away from the sort of natural products themselves. It's about 2/3 of all drugs that have been approved owe some heritage to natural products, and that's often in the form of biological insights, some aspects of structure sometimes, but very few natural products themselves are ever actually approved as drugs. And this makes perfect sense because these are secondary metabolites, often with sort of unknown functions that we don't understand. They were never intended for our use. We've happened to find a use for them. So I think, a lot of money has gone to the more expensive later stages of clinical development of these substances that aren't actually that novel in my opinion. They, in a strictly legal sense and a patent sense, they're novel, but I don't think they actually offer that much value necessarily. And the reason people have done this is simply because they're the lowest risk sort of opportunities in the space. The timeline to develop a drug, can be 10 to 15 years from concept to market. It's a very high risk, slow going process. Expenditures can be, hundreds of millions of dollars to more than $1 billion, depending on the program and depending on how many failures are involved along the way. So, I think the people who were in the space early on have taken a relatively de-risked approach, given all of these considerations, but I actually don't think that's where the most impact is going to come, in this industry in future.
Thank you, Stan. Martin, this is also sort of, your potential soapbox. Do you have any thoughts on this?
Sure, yeah. So I have a similar background, I think, to Sam in some ways in drug development and drug research. So the numbers that Sam threw out there are absolutely correct. In the general pharmaceutical development space, then $1 to $2 billion is not an uncommon sort of budget for bringing a drug from the very first stages of fragment-based or other fast, high-throughput drug discovery through to a final product. A fair bit of it certainly is related to failure of candidate, but a fair bit of it is related to the latter stages of drug commercialization and so on. But we have an interesting parallel perhaps between the psychedelic scene and a group of compounds called kinase inhibitors, where there's a relatively small group of compounds which have been established to be effective. Psychedelics, I think, is an even smaller group of compounds because we have a pretty fair idea of how 5-HT serotonin 2A receptor agonists or modulators work now, although that knowledge base is increasing all the time. So in some ways, I think we can narrow down more quickly and more efficiently in that process. So that should bring some of the costs down and potentially some of the failed candidates, the number of failed candidates down. But nonetheless, Sam's absolutely correct. There's a lot of foundational work, and that just simply costs money. It needs people on the ground. On the other hand, I'm well cognizant of the huge amount of sort of knowledge in the public domain based on the drug discovery efforts of Sasha Trigan and Dave Nichols and a number of the leading lights in this area. Dave Nichols, different Dave, obviously. Look, I think we have a strong foundation. We can probably springboard off that, and that's actually leading us on a relatively narrow and perhaps almost a dead-end path in terms of new drug companies endeavouring to narrow down their field, cut their costs, and cut to the chase of carving out their own little IP, which is, I suspect, where we're going to get to in this conversation. Try and narrow down and carve out their IP in terms of effective drugs at a minimal sort of cost of development. I'll leave it there so we can open it up.
I was going to add that probably at the pointy end of things being narrowed down is the whole class of non-hallucinogenic psychedelic substances, which might at first glance appear to be a bit of a misnomer, but the idea that you would have psychedelics that could be utilized for their pure biochemical quality to create everything from neuroplasticity to prevent neurodegeneration. And this is, I think a lot of us could be quite divided on this subject. I see potential value from a harm reduction perspective if the growth of that industry leads to a leaching away from the typical antidepressant type industry. However, I also fear that the growth of that industry could also equally lead to a leaching of both interest and research away from the psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy industry, which is, obviously that is a particular passion for me. Anyone with any particular thoughts on this? Leaving it open to anyone on the panel to answer.
I've got my hand up. I feel like what was his name on Welcome Back, Cotter, who was going, I read a beautiful paper this morning by David Olson and Kurt Rasmussen at UC Davis, exactly along these lines. It's very interesting to see, and I think it leads us to some very potentially fruitful angles in this area. There is an interesting and productive debate, I think, as to whether the psychedelic, experiential effects of classic psychedelics are absolutely crucial for therapeutic benefit. And this might actually be something of a liberator for this end of the conversation, because if non-psychedelic psychoplastogens, that is the name for these compounds, could be the future of therapeutic psychedelic. And in fact, that might free up psychedelics themselves into the realm they came from and they potentially could go to. So I think this could be an interesting angle. I don't have a particular sort of answer to this question, but I think it really opens up some very interesting facets of the debate.
Thanks, Martin. Sean?
Yeah, I think the point I'd make on all this, Prash, and I feel like those stats that Sam quoted are really interesting, and I think gel with our general feel of the industry. I feel like I'd almost categorise it as almost contrived IP that a lot of companies have come up with, where they've really just tried to tweak molecules that end up with the same effect for the sake of creating IP. And this is probably, in my view, the area where the corporate world has the most negative influence on psychedelics, is it's directing energy and dollars into the creation of IP for the sake of it, as opposed to new therapeutic treatments or the like. I think where we want to try and hold the industry to account is that new novel work, looking at creating new drugs that are treating new conditions, as opposed to tweaking existing molecules to do the same thing that we're doing with the natural molecule. And certainly as a company, when we looked at starting it up, our focus, a lot of what we've put the effort into, certainly for our clinical trial, is around, we're not looking at any novel drug registration or anything. It's all around therapy practices and patient, dealing with the patient once they're under the effect of it. Clearly, from the fact that we're growing mushrooms, we are of a belief that nature's already given us the molecule that we need, and where we need to be putting more effort into as an industry is how we deal with the patient once they have taken the drug.
Yeah, I mean, on that front, I think that in some ways, a lot of this conversation is kind of premature, right? I think if we consider the current available evidence to already be discussing sort of treatment rollouts and the future of what compounds look like that are going to be more effective for the next generation of psychedelic therapy. I mean, we don't even have psychedelic therapy. Right now, the organization that is the farthest ahead as far as clinical trials, that their approval is going to hinge on like less than 500 people ever having done MDMA plus psychotherapy. Like, that's nothing. if we compare that to like drug trials, across the board, like this is phenomenally tiny as far as their sample size. And then if we actually drill down, if we look at the fact that their phase 2 research wasn't actually a multi-site phase 2, but was a bunch of different tiny phase 2 study sites that were all sort of brought together despite their heterogeneous nature, and then sort of massaged to fit a particular narrative with inconvenient dropouts being missed and this, that, and the other. Like what are we actually advancing as far as like talking about approval and this generation and that generation? And that's not to say that I'm opposed to the idea of psychedelic therapy, but the organization conducting the therapy doesn't even know what the therapy is. And Sean, I'm really interested, like I appreciate your point about focusing on, you didn't say therapeutic alliance, but whether it's the therapeutic alliance or actually drilling into some of that, like I'm really curious to see what your clinical trial shows, because when Lily and I interviewed the head of training for MAPS and pointed out that we had concerns about standardization because their therapist manual consists of 13 different therapeutic modalities, so-called, including like totally woo-woo, non-evidence-based interventions, she told us, no, it doesn't. And we went back and forth a few times until we read to her from the therapist manual, and then she agreed that it in fact allowed for all of that. And so I think there is this huge question of what's going on in the black box of the therapy, what is actually being recorded, what is being documented, at the point where we've seen video evidence that contradicts what's been reported, at the point where we've talked to other trial participants who tell us things that, if true and verified by the video from their sessions, raise huge questions about what do you call it? Not standardization, but adherence, right? Are the things, like we're giving people hugely suggestibility enhancing drugs, doing all sorts of things to them that may or may not enhance a natural or a presumed placebo effect, and trusting self-reports. Like there are sort of major methodological things here that I would love to see the research trouble, and I would love to see qualitative analysis and engagement with it. The problem that I get when I put this, because I've had corporate folks come to me and say, you're problematizing all this, you got a bone to pick, okay, fine, what do we do about it? And I say, let's go back to phase 2 and run the trials again. And they roll their eyes and say, the funding, the time, you really want us to wait 5 and 10 years and spend however much more money on it? But like, if we're gonna do good science, yes?
So I have a question. So I think one of the arguments that's often made for drug development, or the need for drug development, is standardization, that we need to standardize, even though, as you pointed out, there are a million other variables within the psychedelic therapy process, almost impossible to standardize. So if we're going to move away then from that medical model, I have a question I'm going to start with for Lily and for Sean. Sean, because you're growing whole mushroom, and Lily, because you've treated legalization right from the outset. Will legalization kill the drug development model?
You want me to start? Look, I don't think so, Prash. I think that I feel like there's. So if we focus on Australia for the moment, that's the market that we're operating in and that we're looking closely at. I think from a drug development point of view, or I really want to expand the terminology around the sorts of companies in this space from drug development pharmaceutical company. It's to deliver this treatment, you've got to have a very strong therapy bent to you, to your service offering. So look, within Australia, I think the reality of the situation that we have with the TGA, with the regulators that we have, with the compliance that we have, legalisation is one thing that won't allow a treatment regime to be accessed and approved within the healthcare system. And so I think we need to expand thinking beyond drug development. And certainly I think that's, as we all know, that's a narrow and small part of the overall treatment that a patient would receive under the way clinical trials have been administered, and think of it more as a delivery of therapy. And that's not going to happen in the current environment that we have in Australia, just because we've legalised psychedelics within the community.
Lily, thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, my position is decriminalize everything and allow people access to the drugs they want and drug testing and safe supply and knowledge and information, and then, you know, allow for them to, you know, choose the environment in which they take the drugs with a full understanding of the risks and the possible benefits, you know? And I think whether it's spiritualized use, recreational use, use at home, use at parties, use with a doctor or a therapist or a shaman or a charlatan, like, you know, whatever it is that people want to do, I think that when you decriminalize the drugs, then you reduce barriers to support seeking and help seeking and reporting problems if they arise. You make it easier to access information and safe supply. I think we will see better research in a world of decrim, because I think it will remove the specter of criminalization and really a lot of the narratives that have been used to insulate and protect bad actors in the space have been, oh, we need to protect them from law enforcement, or we need to protect the movement from going back in time and kind of reinvigorating prohibition. And so I think if we can remove that specter and we kind of undercut those narratives, and then it's like, okay, cool, well, let's deal with these things on their merits. And, you know, as far as the relationship between decrim and drug development, look, I think it's people are going to be interested in continuing to develop possible experimental interventions using a range of chemicals and drugs. I don't think that that's going to go anywhere. If anything, I am very concerned that drug development and medicalization are impeding efforts for decriminalization or have the capacity to do so, because within the dominant narrative of medicalization and proponents of medicalization, I catch a lot of talk about the notion that it is safer in a therapeutic setting, or it is safer in a medical setting than it is in these other settings. And then there's this reality where, as a consequence of medicalization and framing these drugs as therapeutic treatments, which they're not treatments, they're experimental interventions that are being trialed. But by talking about them as a done deal and marketing them in this way, you have a number of people out there who would not have otherwise taken drugs, would not have otherwise sought out psychedelics and psychedelic experience, are really vulnerable psychologically and possibly medically, seeking out the drugs and taking them in contexts where they might not have taken them otherwise, and then finding themselves, you know, sometimes in dire straits and sometimes just really disappointed because they didn't get the miracle cure. That happens in clinical trials, but it also happens outside of them. And so I think there has been such a shift in the discourse and the narratives around psychedelic drug use as a consequence of medicalization, that I think those narratives need to be challenged, and I think we need to have a more plural approach.
It's an interesting point that you raised about the increased access that this could have to people who otherwise wouldn't have sought access. And something I'd like to bring up is ketamine, and in particular, at-home ketamine. So there are companies like New Life, Novomind, based in North America, in the US and Canada. I know, for example, that you can sign up to one of these companies, have a video consult with a physician, and then be delivered ketamine lozenges, I think up to 12 lozenges at a time, to your home. It just gets delivered in a package, and then you're supposed to engage with a video call or engage on an app with a therapist after. I shouldn't have laughed, I've given away my bias. Apologies. But keen to hear anyone's thoughts on this. You know, I see a risk of a big pharma becoming the new drug dealers. But again, revealing my bias once again. Martin, got your hand up?
Yeah, look, I think ketamine has turned out to be the gateway drug, sorry to use a hackneyed phrase, to psychedelic therapy on several levels. And I feel we have a lot to gain by taking ketamine as a useful case study. I really have a strong sense, and I did deeply hope that Spravato, for example, will be blown out of the water as a big pharma con, and that analogous trends in the area of classic psychedelics will be recognised and called out. The reason I say that really is that I don't know how much people know this, but Spravato, which is esketamine in a nasal formulation, is essentially 20 times the price per dose of racemic ketamine, which can be administered perfectly satisfactorily under medical supervision, not at home probably, essentially, although a number of companies have tried that by now. And that essentially it's just, that is the carving out of IP, and it's a very cynical ploy, in my opinion, by Big Pharma. Now, with absolute respect and deference to Sean and to Sam, I mean, there's a distinction between Big Pharma and small pharma, or the biotech and pharmaceutical startups who are really coming from a better place, I believe. But I would be very happy to see those large established pharmaceutical companies sort of stop in their tracks in this regard. I think it's a cynical approach on their part.
You do see this distinction between, I think it's a really good point, Martin, but the distinction between big pharma and small pharma, because people hear the word pharma or pharmaceuticals and don't always make that distinction. But, big pharma are some of the wealthiest companies, the household names of some of the biggest companies on earth. They make enormous profits. They operate like any other large corporate would. And often we know that large corporations, sometimes are bad actors, in a very general sense. Or more cynical or more exploitative in their approaches to making profit, in a way that smaller companies definitely aren't. And I've sort of, for example, personally, I've been an academic, I've done a few other things. I've never considered myself really like a big pharma type. I'm not a big pharma executive. I've come to this space out of a desire to have some positive impact, and the way we operate and our sort of values really reflect that. And I think that's probably true of a lot of the smaller companies in the space, looking to do some good, looking to do some really innovative work. It's a completely different approach to what you'll see at the larger end of the market.
I actually think, so with small pharma, it's particularly fun because there's actually a company in the UK named Small Pharma that's doing DMT research. And I filed a complaint against them because their chief scientific officer / chief medical officer, Carol Rutledge, was running around while announcing that they were doing phase 1 clinical trials that showed that DMT actually resets the processes in the brain. See, it disrupts the ruminative processes and cures your depression. Now, she said this as they were announcing phase 1 trials, right? So you haven't even done the trial, so how do you know what the conclusion is? They agreed to be subjected to the overarching UK regulatory board. Then when the regulatory board was about to sanction them, they said, oh, actually, we're withdrawing our consent to this this was the industry internal regulatory board. The internal regulatory board said, sure, fine, we'll now hand you over to the regulatory board with teeth. They took a moment and said, oh, no, we would much rather be regulated by the self-regulatory board. And then they got slapped with some very small warnings about how they were or were not to advertise their, exploratory research. And I think I appreciate the things that happen at different scales of corporations. But when I sat down with Dr. Rutledge and I asked her about her familiarity with clinical issues, with the legacies of impropriety from practitioners, people going back to the 80s and looking at Ricky and Grassi and these really important, and I would contend like seminal moments in when we think how does this research get framed and who are the people who are coming to the table and what knowledge and awareness do they have of the myriad of clinical and ethical issues. In my experience, it's not so much a matter of scope or scale or size. I think there is a rush to produce something And there's a lack of consideration about, what's actually going on around this. I mean, in talking to people about some of the components of the studies they're proposing, or the analogies or metaphors that they use to present, whether we're talking about, resetting your brain or defragging a hard drive, there's this propensity for people involved in the medicalization of psychedelic drugs to resort to metaphor as meaning, where there are fundamentally empty statements that are made about how these things are going to heal people. But if you actually strip them back and try to find the mechanism being proposed, it seems perpetually elusive. And I think, again, I think that exists sort of irrespective of scale.
Thank you, David. I'm just going to pause everyone there because we've got 5 minutes left and there are a couple of questions, and I'll start off with one here, which I quite like. For the panel, is there a type of professional slash expertise that is needed but missing from the psychedelics industry? And I might start this off because I've just come from a range of different psychedelic conferences over the last couple of months. And in short, one thing I will say is that there certainly seems to be a lack of grown-ups in the room. It's one of the reasons, I guess, I see a lot of value. I saw a lot of value in inviting Sean to this panel, for example. Certainly in the companies and certainly in the people who are working on the capital side of the system, there certainly seems to be a lack of grown-ups in the room. There's a lot of what have been termed cannabros from the medical cannabis industry. There's a lot of ex-crypto people. There's a lot of people who made a lot of money very, very quickly. And I think that can be quite reflective of how the space tends to be portrayed. And so people who come from more long-standing industries, who have a long career in the consulting, with regulatory expertise, with strong financial backgrounds and risk management backgrounds. This is kind of what I meant by the grown-ups in the room. That's certainly my observation of the kind of expertise that is missing. Keen to hear from anyone else on the panel.
Yeah, I agree, Pressure. I think that like any early stage industry, I would say that as an industry, we need more of everything, not just people evangelizing for the psychedelics. I think as far as an early stage industry and an industry that is to be developed, psychedelics is, in my view, not a special case. It needs all of the expertise that any other industry that is forming that would require. So whether that's technical research expertise, corporate expertise, legal, government, the whole gamut that any other industry needs, psychedelics needs as well.
Yeah, this is a point that I've spent a lot of time talking about and thinking about. I don't really think of people on the sort of financial side of things as the adults that I've been calling for, the adults I'm in the room, so to speak. I would advocate for experts in other fields. So, for example, the psychotherapy component to psychotherapy is massive. And I think it's going to take a lot of hands on deck to produce the kind of volume of knowledge and insight needed in order to have that be something that has any hope of being safe, let alone effective. And so, I think there's a real need to engage in the peer review process and in research with people who are psychedelic naive, are psychedelic neutral, are psychedelic skeptical, are psychedelic disinterested, where they are first and foremost, in the field of psychotherapy. Or like for me, my background is, victimology, but also sexual violence prevention and response. And I've written policies for institutions that were looking to have comprehensive sexual misconduct policies and procedures for staff and students. And one of the things I have learned from that work, as well as the evidence-based sexual violence prevention and resistance education work that I've been involved with, is that there's a whole body of research, for example, on how to prevent and respond to these types of harm and violence in a range of different settings. And so then when I see attempts to kind of like reinvent the wheel or paper over as though this is a thing that a group is trying to manage or handle, I'm looking at that as an outside expert going like, they are engaging in some of the same problematic institutional patterns of behavior in the psychedelic landscape as they do in this university landscape or as they do in this workplace landscape. There's ways to work through some of this. So I'm just using an example from my own background and my own expertise, but I think it's kind of across the board. And for me personally, I would say that it is my opinion that before there's much emphasis on the financial side and the business side and the even like some of the pharmaceutical research, to me, my focus is on the ethics and the safety of what is going on in these medical and pseudo-medical contexts or medical adjacent contexts or spiritual healing contexts, these places where you're combining drugs with really complex power differentials and vulnerable people being put into states that make them more vulnerable and suggestible.
And super quick, some of the grownups I'd like to see in the room would be like ethicists and like research data nerds, because we've plopped some of the methodologies and some of the questions and some of the data in front of folks who have just been sort of floored, like I think, and super brief.
David,
I think there's
I'm getting cut off here because we've actually breached our time, so we might need to call it at this point, unfortunately.
Okay, yeah, it was just the one sentence,
Go ahead. We'll hear the one sentence out.
So there's, to the degree that people can dismiss psychedelic research out of hand as not being serious enough to merit their time, I think unless and until we're willing to do rigorous research within the space, the problems that lurk in the data are going to lurk, and then it's going to interfere with any push towards like widespread medicalization, because suddenly people will pay attention and problematize what the psychedelic field thought was ready for prime time.
Thank you, David. Thank you, everyone. Wish we could keep talking. And thank you, EJ, for your time. See you, as many of you as we can, tomorrow in person.
Great topic. Thanks everybody for your input.